Hello and welcome to In Conversation, part of the University Mental Health Charter Programme. My name is Dr. Gareth Hughes, and I'm delighted that you were able to join us. Today, we're going to be talking about community and belonging and its importance to mental health. And I'm delighted to say that we're joined this morning by Dr. Alyson Dodd. Alyson is the Associate Professor in Psychology at the Northumbria University. She's interested in understanding how to support wellbeing across the university community, both staff and students. And it's something she's looked at both in her research and also in her kind of day-to-day work as a lecturer. So Alyson, thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Great. So can we just start by talking a little bit about why this issue matters and why it's important? Why do we put such a focus on belonging and community when we're talking about mental health and well-being in universities?
I think it's something that isn't just important in universities, but social connection, relationships with each other is important for mental health for everybody. And in universities, it's a particular setting where you can form connections with people that you see in a day-to-day way. And we have students who are obviously going through a major life transition, and they do really, really need that support, social support from peers, from lecturers, from other members of staff during that kind of tricky time, because it's a very liminal phase for them. And it just comes out time and time again as something that's so strongly linked to student mental health. And also it's something that it, I guess, doesn't take a lot of resource. It's something that quite naturally happens between people, but we do need to understand how we can support students in forming those connections given the tricky transition that they're in. And we know that loneliness in students is obviously something that's incredibly tricky and incredibly detrimental to all sorts of different outcomes for them, because it's not just about mental health as well. Belonging has been linked to academic outcomes, likelihood of staying at uni, all of these different things. And I know that Nicola Byram at King's College is doing a huge medical research council funded project called You Belong at the moment, focused on exactly this, because it is so important, understanding the impact of belonging, what it means to students, and how we can avoid students from not feeling a sense of belonging.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, that, isn't it? Because we often like to kind of hold different aspects of our experience in different boxes, but actually they are so interconnected. And the fact that, how much a student feels that they belong and what community connection they make can actually impact on their academic performance is something we don't think about, that interconnection enough, really, do we?
Definitely. And it's talked about a lot in relation to all aspects of the student experience. And if you kind of just do a quick search for belonging students university, you'll find lots of research that's been done linking it to, like I say, all of those different aspects of academic life, engagement with university, and of course, mental health and well-being as well. But it's one of those concepts where, a bit like well-being itself, it means lots of different things. Lots of people define it in different ways, so that makes it tricky to fully understand as well.
Yeah, that's an important point. Perhaps we'll come on and just tease that apart a little bit in a moment, I think. But you've in your work then, you've talked about something called you class as community well-being, and that as a concept. Can you just talk me through what you see, how you see that as being different?
Yeah, it is. It's a really tricky concept to describe. It took me a while to get my head around it when I first started doing work in this area, but as soon as I came across it, doing work on community, well, not on community per se, but on well-being in universities, it just struck me as something that fit very well as the university as a community, rather than a community of place, a community of kind of shared interest and purpose, and sort of shared reason for being there. And it's basically the conditions in a community that help a community to thrive. It's at many levels, kind of social, economic, cultural. So it lends itself really well to settings approaches such as, well, the University Mental Health Charter. And it's basically about being well together. So it's more of a collective experience rather than just how an individual feels in that setting. So it's traditionally been, research has traditionally been undertaken in communities of place, so neighbourhoods, basically things that we would more traditionally view as communities. But we do talk about community a lot when it comes to universities, and that's why I just felt like it was a really useful lens in which to explore well-being in universities. Basically goes beyond a collection of individuals and how they feel and their own well-being, to the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, that kind of idea.
Mm.
and the strength of connections between individuals and the social relationships between people in the community rather than just one individual's social relationships. Um, and it goes beyond that to the physical environment being fit for purpose, the physical environment facilitating the connection in the first place, giving people access to what they need, people feeling comfortable and secure, being able to speak up and having psychological safety, genuine and useful leaders. It really does capture the holistic university, which is what the University Mental Health Charter is all about.
Mm. Absolutely, yeah. And again, it's that interconnection of all of those different aspects, isn't it? And we'll perhaps come on and talk about this a little bit. But one of the things that strikes me from that concept particularly is that it's also a little bit at odds with the way in which we've started thinking about universities as being individuals purchasing their own experience.
Absolutely.
And there's a tension there, I think, isn't there, between the idea of, well, are students just coming and purchasing an education and going away again, or are they members of the community of learning for their time when they're with us? And I think that poses a whole set of difficult questions for us, doesn't it?
Definitely. And I think that we've not done enough to speak to students about that. And there is obviously work happening now, but we don't fully understand how strong their drive is for community or their understanding of it. So I guess the research that I've done is a kind of a first step there, um, regarding well-being of the community and how students view that rather than just talking about themselves. And there are, of course, tensions between the kind of the role of consumer. Like students do expect opportunities to be there, to build connections. They expect activities and events that bring them together. They expect classroom activities to bring them together and kind of that value added to get them there in the first place. Like offer them something that brings them to campus and into the classroom. Um, but there is that need for reciprocity. Students know that they need to engage with those opportunities, but how we really get them to is, I think, one of those tricky things. And that kind of idea of like care and compassion and connection over and above efficiency and output. And I think both staff and students have kind of um, started focusing a lot on efficiency and output in different ways, but that is kind of how the culture is at the moment.
Mm.
Um, and I think a lot of that's come from that kind of consumerist standpoint, I guess.
Yeah, and there's also, I mean, I guess this then starts stretching out into some of the other themes across the charter because I'm just struck by what you're saying that that also then links into how we perceive learning, teaching, and assessment, and if we perceive that as being a task completion and reward thing, and that's what you're focused on, complete your task, get your grade, rather than the actual learning that you do, then that individualist approach makes perfect sense. But actually, if you pull back to think about how learning actually happens and that collaborative classrooms and learning communities mean that everybody learns more, then actually if you put your focus on learning, none of it makes sense. But where there is that whole tension between those two things at the moment that's really difficult to navigate.
Yeah, and I'm seeing that a lot, and this is very anecdotal, but the kind of the focus on the output, the assessment, rather than the process of learning, like you say, the actual knowledge, and the kind of the shared joy in that knowledge is something that I think would really bring students together when that exists. But the emphasis, unfortunately, is often what's the exam, what's going to be on the
Mm.
exam, what do I need to know for that, when's it going to be, right from the very start of the semester, and I'm seeing that more and more. Um, and I do think that that probably means that social connection and those types of community building initiatives kind of take a bit of a back burner,
Mm.
when that is the emphasis.
It's just on that. I'm just wondering, do you, because of that, do you also then sometimes get a sense that rather than kind of the classroom becoming a place of community, that starts to become a place of competition, that students see themselves as competing with each other if they're really focused on the final assessment?
I think possibly, and the thing is, when they've got quite strong communities, that can be obviously a really positive thing, but also the ripple effects of kind of negativity within a small, tightly bound community are stronger. That's what
Yes.
students actually said in their own words to me when I spoke to them about it. So there's that kind of peer support on one hand, but also misinformation and kind of stress breeding stress and kind of, I guess, stressing each other out is how they would describe
Yeah.
it. And yeah, I guess competition for internships and all those other things that they know are going to boost their CV, does come into play there definitely. But I don't know if I see a lot of competition per se between students. It's more self competition. I'm not sure if that's the best way to put
Mm.
it, but just that kind of I want to do well at uni.
Mm.
And I don't think that they think about it so much in relation to each other. And actually, maybe that's part of the problem, not thinking about it in relation to each other. Not that we want them to be competitive, but that kind of coming together in some way to kind of support each other, I think is really important,
Yeah.
and maybe gets a bit lost in the individualism.
Yeah. So just to build on that then a little bit what we've been talking about, because one of the things we've seen when we've done analysis of the charter award reports is there's definitely been a change in the last few years in terms of how socializing is happening within universities, how students are able to engage in socializing with each other. And we're definitely seeing there was an impact post-COVID, and then there's been a cost of living crisis impact as well.
Yeah.
Um, and that therefore obviously students appear to be on campus less, appear to be engaging with socially less. Is that something that you're picking up in your work as well?
Yeah, yeah. Both kind of in my work, but also again, just from personal observation, working in the higher education
Mm,
sector, you see student attendance is getting lower over time, and I think especially since COVID. And I guess that's not surprising given the age of the students now are those that really experienced that when they were in those very formative time, at
mm,
school. But also colleagues working from home more than they did before as well is an observation I've made, and something that came up time and time again when I interviewed staff about community wellbeing. So both anecdotal and kind of evidence based. Um, and I think because students see staff as kind of stable anchors, people who have been in the community for longer and they understand how the university works, and they want them to model community to them. But if we can't get students onto campus and into the lecture theatre and engaging in all sorts of activities that happen on campus, and a lot of our offices are empty as staff, then that's going to become a barrier to connection in the community and community building in general.
mm,
And I think that COVID and cost of living have both had an impact on that. So with the cost of living, it's being on campus, it costs money, buying
mm,
food, buying drinks, getting there. I mean, our food and drink on campus is not cheap. Luckily, we're city centre based, so there's opportunity and choice there, but that's not the case in a lot of universities, at campus universities. And also, our students are doing many hours of paid work as well.
mm,
And that gives them less opportunity to come onto campus because they're more likely to just come in for what they need to be in for rather than sticking around and going and having lunch with a friend in the student union bar, or going to the library and studying when they're around other students, which I think is really important for a sense of connection. And that came up when I interviewed
mm.
students. um, so yeah, I think that kind of comes back full circle to the classroom as being an important place for community, because for many students it's the only guaranteed contact they're going to have.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's an interesting thing in what you said there as well, that because I think there's a grasp that people are getting generally that students are less able to socialize, less able to engage in social activity. But the fact that actually some of this is now also impacting on their ability to actually come to class
Yeah,
itself is now starting to that it's not just disrupting the what we might think of as extracurricular things, it's actually disrupting core education,
yeah,
which is a concerning thing in and of itself.
yeah,
And I also wondered a little bit about, because before all of this happened, it was kind of already becoming. I'm always struck by when people outside the sector talk about universities, and there's a kind of an ideal in their head about what universities used to be like, with small student groups, small tutorial groups. But actually, we were already through massification reaching a point where the classroom being a place of learning of community for some students was actually quite hard. If you're in a lecture theatre of 200, that doesn't feel like a kind of a community space necessarily.
yeah. I
Um,
mean, lecture theatre of 400
yeah.
people. Yeah,
So there was already challenge to our ability to create that community naturally in the classroom for depending on which subject you're in, obviously. So we're kind of having practical challenge layered on top of practical challenge at the moment. Does that feel right to you?
I completely agree. I think that when you speak to staff, and again, this is both from my experience of being a lecturer, but also speaking to lecturers in a research context, they see this and they feel a lot of pressure from that, because they want to be able to help students to form connections with each other. They want to form connections with students, and that becomes more and more difficult to do when you have massification.
Mm,
And I interviewed students about their quality of life and what that meant to them, and what dimensions of life were important, and how quality what's the word I'm looking for, how they kind of gauged quality within those life domains. In student quality of life, one of the really important things was obviously social connection, relationships with peers, but they would say things like, but I walk into a room and there's like 400 people in there and I'm just this tiny person and I don't know how to navigate that because I was at school and I was seeing the same people all of the time. And there was, 30 of us, which probably felt huge at the time, but now there's just all these faces. And I think that that is definitely going to have an impact. I mean, it would have done with me,
Mm,
definitely. And then it's from both staff and students. And that kind of, how can you have lots of small group teaching when you've got a cohort size of many hundreds
mm.
and you don't have the resource to split them up into tiny groups and stretch staff out in that way? It's, yeah, that definitely, I think, makes it harder.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are, I mean, clearly there are lots of practical challenges at the moment that we can see to creating community. Can we just go back to something you said a little bit earlier on as well, though, in terms of the fact that there's also some of the ways in which we think about this are also problematic because you can say community is defined very differently. Belonging is defined very differently in different places. Those words don't actually hold a fixed meaning. Um, and also, there are other words that people use sometimes, like mattering, about whether mattering is more important than belonging, for instance. But again, the way that all those words get interpreted is quite difficult. Quite often, I think we don't actually really know what we mean when we're talking about this.
Definitely. And I think that we use definitions from other places and try and apply them in higher education. And obviously, context is important for any kind of definition of well-being, community well-being, quality of life, all of these different concepts that I'm doing work to try and unpick and disentangle in this setting, because they are so context specific. And we need to understand what these concepts mean before we can have any chance of putting in place initiatives that actually support them. So we can't support community building until we know what community means in the university, which again is one of the driving factors for wanting to do a project on community well-being. And it's not just about building communities, but sustaining them. So
Yeah.
there's a lot that you need to understand there. Um, and of course, students are constantly moving in and out of their student identity as well. So it might mean different things to them in their multiple identities that they have. They've got large spells of time when they're not studying. They might not even be in the same town or city where they study. So how to understand what community means in that context to them, I think is very tricky because they have multiple communities both in the university and beyond it as well, um, like we all do. So it's kind of, what do they need when they are
Mm.
with us and they're on campus and it's teaching time, which is
Yeah.
when they're guaranteed to be there, or they should be.
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. And there's an interesting point as well because we talk a lot of the literature and a lot of the wider discussion that you might see online around this talks about community as if there's one university community for that people will belong to. You were already there just talking about the fact that actually they are belong to a multiple communities within that. And I suppose that there's a challenge in that then for how does a university think about, is there one community or how does it think about the communities within the one big community?
Yeah, and I think that you get quite a lot of this, when you look at universities, I mean, they'll talk about university identity and, there's all the branding and that was picked up as something that was quite important to students, their identity as a student of that university. But really what they were saying, and this was staff as well, was that, you know, who the community is important. And the students used a lot of metaphors like concentric circles, for example, or webs, like spider webs, to demonstrate that to them, the university community is very much made up of multiple interconnected, smaller communities that could be quite dynamic and transient as well.
Mm,
And they spoke more about those smaller communities as being of particular importance to them. And they could absolutely be in multiple communities, and that was important to them because it was expanding their horizons, building social capital. That was something that came up. I mean, they didn't use the word social capital, but when they were describing it, it was very much a kind of building a support network, but also a network where they can get the information and advice that they need, and that included staff. But to a lesser extent for them, they kind of saw staff, like I was saying before, as like stable anchors to model community and to give them opportunities. But it was other students that were really, really important.
Mm.
And they just needed opportunities to connect with each other. Um, so yeah, I think that there are hierarchies of community, and it was the same for staff, because staff are obviously really important when we talk about any kind of well-being in universities, and staff equally. It kind of started with the people they worked with on a day-to-day basis, and then expanded out.
Good. So there's a couple of things in what you said there that I think are worth picking up on. One of which is that that's a sense of hierarchy between communities,
Mhm.
and whether those are official hierarchies or they're just kind of an informal thing that happened within the student community. And there is a kind of challenge in that, isn't there, about which communities get prioritized and which communities are seen? Because I think also we've got a number of communities within universities who very often feel that they're invisible.
Yeah.
Um, and I think particularly, I mean, and this isn't necessarily always broken down in terms of demographic things. One of the communities that quite often talk about being invisible are PhD students.
Mm.
They'll quite
Yeah.
often say they're always forgotten, always not thought about, always not visible. And so there's also, I think, a challenge for universities to think about how, if there are tension between communities, if there are hierarchies, what impact does it have if the communities that you feel like are at the forgotten end of that hierarchical structure, or the lower end of the hierarchical structure, if what how do you then feel in terms of the sense of value that you have within the university overall?
Yeah. And this is something that came up with a lot of students around. They just needed choices and options to fulfill their own social needs. And you get the very organized social structures like clubs, teams, societies, but not everybody wants to be part of those. And
Mm,
universities tend to invest in those and promote them. But there are other groups that exist, and they need places to get together as well. They need all of those things that support them to build community and to sustain communities. And building their own communities was something that came up with students about, it's more meaningful if it's something that they want to be a part of rather than something
mm,
they're being forced to be a part of. And
mm,
the allocation of resource and equitable allocation of resource was something that came up quite a lot. They wanted all pockets of the student community to have the equity and the same opportunities, and that includes kind of, I guess, less formal, smaller communities within the university, and just quite simple things like just somewhere we can go and sit for free and get together. They're not saying they want universities to throw them in their little group of friends parties or something. It was just, we want to be on campus and be together. We don't necessarily want to spend money doing that, and there's not a lot of breakout space or
mm.
places to just go and sit. The amount of times that people just mentioned, like, oh, it's great to have just there's seats there, and that makes it a good space, and it just seats. That's it, just somewhere to sit.
That's a really important point as well, though, isn't it? Because as universities have increased their student numbers, teaching space has taken over more and more of the campus. Um, Actually, there's less and less informal social space on many university campuses now, which again, that poses a problem, doesn't it? Where do students just simply go and be together?
The library is one of the things that came up a lot. The library was so important to them. It was very much a place that they there was kind of different spaces in the library that they knew they could go to fulfill different levels of social needs. So they were going there to study, which is obviously a really crucial thing for students. But they also valued it as a place that kind of transcended the studying space and was very sociable. And it helped them to have that strong identity, like, I'm a student, I'm in the library, I'm with other students, I'm studying, I'm maybe not even speaking to anyone, but I can see that other people are here doing the same thing as me. And there was a lot of kind of connection and belonging that arose
Mm,
from that. And loads of them mentioned the library. Um, but I think to me, the message was that students will make spaces work for them, but the spaces need to be there. And to start using them, they need a reason to. So they have a reason to go to the library, and therefore that's become a hub, like a community hub, if you will. And then it becomes their place. But other places could have that, but I think we need to get them in there in the first place to get used to it and to feel a sense of belonging to the physical space. And it's just kind of happened quite naturally with the library because it has a very clear purpose. But then you hear things about universities wanting to, close down libraries and, just have a much smaller space somewhere because they're not being utilized enough and because of, the pressures in the sector. Um, and, when students value that so much,
Mm,
because they'll say, oh, but we don't need these physical books, so we don't need all this space. But actually you speak to students and they're like, oh, but if I go to that floor of the library, there's that place for group work and that's brilliant. And if I go to that floor of the library, I know I can study alone and not be interrupted, but again, I'm around people.
mm,
So that kind of short-sighted removal of space, I think, will become a problem because the physical environment came up very strongly. It was a core component of community well-being for students, was places to get together and places where they felt like they belonged and had some kind of identity with and sense of ownership over.
there's a really interesting thing about a lot of this, isn't there? About the fact that there's a kind of that consumerist idea we talked about, or the individual idea of the student accessing knowledge. It starts to leave out also the idea of students as being people and
Yeah,
what it is that we need as human beings, and that idea that, well, actually they can just access knowledge. So the metaphor almost seems to be that students are just going to upload knowledge into their brain
yeah,
as though the brain is a computer, rather than actually learning takes place as a social interaction. It takes it's for many people it's a social process,
yeah,
and that actually we can ignore all those things we know people need in order to function well, in order to be healthy, and in order to study and perform well. That
absolutely.
actually all we need to do is just, well, what's the simplest, most effective way of getting the knowledge into their head so they can do the task?
Yeah, like they can get an ebook and they
Yeah.
can access that at home. They can sit in their room on their own at home and they can access an ebook. So why do we need a space that's full of paper books that they're not using? And it's not about the books. And I know that a library is typically, it's a place where you check out books. But it clearly means a lot more to them than that. And they talked a lot about social spaces that they needed on campus, and those spaces kept them on campus. If they're not there, when they come
Mm,
in, they're going to go to a lecture, go to a workshop, and then they're going to go away again. Whereas if they
mm,
have social spaces that they feel like they belong to, they're comfortable in, then they'll go there between taught sessions. They'll go and catch up with friends there after taught sessions. It's like places to just chill out and relax and see friends, like be around other students. And most universities offer these spaces, but I imagine that does vary quite a lot.
yeah.
And there is always the worry that they'll get taken away. And I think that kind of short-sighted, not enough people are using them, but it's like, but if the people that are using them really value them, and also things change over time. So you take something away, it's very difficult to put it back.
Yeah. And also, sometimes it's just about students' awareness that those spaces exist. If they
Yeah,
don't happen to have been in that bit of the building, they won't have noticed it exists. And sometimes it's about how do we make students aware of where those social spaces are and how they can access and how they can use them.
yeah,
I think all of that's really important. I want to come back to one of the other things you were referring to earlier as well, though, because you mentioned staff
yeah,
and the role of staff. And obviously, for students to belong to a community, that there kind of has to be, like as you said earlier, a pre-existing community, which is at least partly established by staff. But I'm aware also that, again, you can go into university campuses now and most of the staff working from home if they're not actively in teaching or if it's not, for their role. Um, and so how does that then affect the overall sense of community if that's also what staff are experiencing, if that sense of community among staff is possibly less than it once was?
yeah. And I think that if staff don't feel connected and aren't kind of showcasing that or modeling that, I guess is the word I used before, then when students are looking to that, then I think that will have a detrimental effect on community well-being as a whole university. And of course, the charter is all about the whole
Mm,
university. And when I spoke to staff, it was very much the hybrid working model came up time and again, but then they would very quickly say, but I really value the flexibility and autonomy I have
mm,
with that. But they would also recognise that they're on campus not all of the time, their colleagues are on campus not all of the time, and they're not generally there at the same time. There's no kind of synchronicity there, with teams all being in place at once. Um, and if a lot of kind of hot desking came up quite a lot with staff as well, where even if they were on campus, they didn't even know where to go and find a particular person. So they would just send an email anyway, or send them a message on Teams anyway, even though that other person might have been on campus. So it's a big problem in staff, that kind of sense of
mm,
connection. And I think that will discourage them from seeing a point in coming onto campus. What they see is unnecessarily. That's kind of this interesting thing. You said before, I'll come onto campus when it's necessary, rather than I'll go onto campus because I'm part of that community and I want to see my colleagues and, the water cooler chats and, not that we have water coolers anymore, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Um, and like I was saying before, if staff aren't really around, that kind of general hustle and bustle of campus lessens, and then the students
Mm.
see that and think, well, why would I be here? It's just a bit empty. And actually, that's kind of an extreme. It's something that might happen, but it is kind of slowly creeping in because when I'm on campus and it's during the semester, I do feel like there's a lot of hustle and bustle, but it gets lesser and it could
Mm.
get lesser as we move more towards turfing staff out of offices to make teaching space, which again makes them feel, well, I don't have any ownership over this space. I don't belong in this space. I feel like I'm camping. That was what somebody who hot desk said. And as that happens more and more, people are going to come in less and less. And again, just a bit short-sighted on that front. And it's to create more teaching space to make more efficient use of the space. And it's all this efficiency again and productivity and people are more productive when they're collegiate, and that's true of both staff and students. And staff need to be modeling that collegiality to
Mm.
students, that kind of working together and being seen together.
Yeah, it's that invisible tension. Sometimes we focus a lot on efficiency and not necessarily on effectiveness,
Yeah.
and what effectively delivers the things we're trying to do, which is really interesting. But I think if we just pick up from there, because I think there are a number of things we don't know in this space, and I think you've just touched on one of them. Certainly, when I'm talking to staff, one of the things they'll say is, "Oh, they value that flexibility. It's better for their well-being that they don't have to be in every day, that they don't have to be doing that journey." But actually, I don't think we know that.
Yeah.
And there's an assumption and I'm very aware as a therapist, there are sometimes things that we think are better for us that actually aren't. um and maybe that flexibility, maybe that working at home on your own so much, actually maybe it has a more of a negative effect on your well-being than being connected to other people would have for you. But we don't know that. There's not really been any research to try and identify which is better and where the right balance point might be.
And,
um
and yeah, I remember you talking about this when we were in London at the Student Mental Health Conference, and I'd not almost not thought about it before because I probably am one of those people who's like, oh, I value working from home some days a week because I don't have to commute and I can get my head down, and whether or not I'm more productive is a question that like I couldn't answer, and it'd be difficult to do research on, but I think absolutely crucial because community does get lost when there's a lack of presence. And you can enable a settings approach like the
mm,
charter. If people aren't in the setting to begin with, that's kind of step one. And that's quite a big barrier at the moment. I think that there are a lot of people who just aren't there. And um, yeah, I mean, how would we go about unpicking that and trying to kind of compare, well, actually, are you really more productive? Do you really feel better? Or
mm,
actually is your washing machine creeping into your head while you're trying to work? And you know that kind of colleagues coming and knocking on your door and you kind of think, well, that's nice, but you feel
mm,
like you've got less done because
yeah.
workload is such a pressure. But then actually speaking to colleagues is a big part of your working day, and that's how it should be because it's building
Mm.
connection, and sometimes it's just sharing information in a very informal way, and that doesn't happen at home.
And that whole idea about the fact that the whole point of universities was to be learning communities where you're puzzling over a problem and you've got a colleague at your next desk you can just talk to about it. Whereas if you're sitting at home, you're puzzling by yourself, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it would be fascinating to actually be able to kind of tease into that and try and work out what is that. And the other aspect of that, which is that community isn't something that you can just take from. If you're going to be part of a community, it also requires that reciprocity, that you're making a contribution to the community, that you as an individual have responsibility to the community to help in some way, to contribute in some way. And again, I wonder both for staff and students if that actually starts to become actually just an odd proposition. Why would I, as a student, if I'm paying all of these fees and I'm coming from education, why would I then have to contribute something else?
Yeah.
But then if you're not contributing to that community, then you don't really belong to it in the same way.
No, definitely. And that ability to like participation, getting involved, having a say, like that came up as a really valuable component of community well-being. But people need the connection and belonging before they feel able to do that.
Mm,
And that responsibility for community is all members of the community have that. And yes, there are leaders who need to model, I'm going to go back to that word again, who need to model community to others. Um, but of course there is a responsibility. You can't just take and then kind of not contribute, like you were saying, because that's not how community works. It's the strength of social connections between people, like I was saying, and that's not a one-way thing.
Mm.
And nor is kind of making change and positive change. It's not a one-way thing. Um, but yeah, like you were saying, it's kind of the difficulty with any kind of settings approach or place-based approach or the whole university approach is that not everyone feels the need to engage in that way, either because they feel like, well, that's not my responsibility, or they just kind of don't want to. They're there to
Mm.
work, they're there to get their degree, to learn. They don't see themselves as an influencer of like some kind of cultural change or shift, or like, you know, having to build connections in order to sustain a community. That's not what they want. And
Mm.
you know, that is obviously detrimental to community well-being when that's all about connections among members of the community and not just individuals. But you also kind of need to respect that some people don't want to engage at the same time. But understanding how to include as many people as possible is very hard, because it's difficult when people aren't engaging. It's difficult to know, is it because they just don't want to, because actually they've got a really strong community outside of the university, they're here for a purpose, they just want to get in, get out, serve
Mhm.
their purpose, or is it because they feel unable to be involved? And I think that is where we need to focus quite a lot of our energy, is picking up those people who want to be more engaged, want to be more involved in the community, want stronger connections, but just feel like they are unable to do so for, don't feel included, feel left out. And I think that that's really important for any kind of whole university approach.
Absolutely. And it's very easy for us sometimes to make assumptions that it's people who don't want to be part of community, but actually who just don't see themselves in it, don't feel they could ever be part of it. And so it's something that doesn't actually enter their mind as a possibility, rather than it being something that they're just definitely, whatever happens or whatever the community look like, they would never be part of that.
Yeah.
I want to just push on to what, but just finally on things that we don't know, because this has always puzzled me in terms of when we're talking about sense of belonging and community, which is that there are some really basic things that we actually don't know. So we don't know how students make friends. We don't know why it works and what happens when it doesn't work. We don't know. There's no real research in that area. We've got lots of assumptions.
Yeah.
We don't know what, the pattern of communities forming, breaking down, and reforming, and how that impacts on individual students over the course of the year. Because we know those friendship groups are often transient.
Mm.
The friendship group in the first semester, the first year, very often isn't the one that ends the first year. But we don't really know how that works. We don't know how that impacts on individuals. And so therefore, it feels like in a lot of ways, we work on a set of assumptions that are probably quite out of date and that are probably not capturing the whole picture.
Yeah, I think we've got quite a decent understanding now of the importance of pure relations and friendships for students. But like you say, not how they actually go about having those. So, in absence of close family and the networks that they had before coming to university, they need to be able to build communities, whether those are very small communities or bigger communities or multiple communities, I guess, based again on their own social need. But yeah, we don't fully understand the ways in which they want to do that and feel able to do that, because they've come from such a different place being at school. And obviously I'm speaking about, usually the students who are the kind of 18 to 20 age bracket, and not mature students there who obviously have different social needs perhaps, and that's something that we need to looking at as well as a whole university approach, and we often neglect, I think, to be
Mm-hmm.
honest. But yet, going back to the forming friendships, they will have formed friendships in their school days in very different ways, just by repeat encounters
Mm-hmm.
and just learning who they liked. And they often don't have those at university, like you say. And in the study I did on student quality of life, they very much talked about the dynamic and changeable environment at university being both something that meant they needed a social network and needed friends, but also was a barrier to them making friends in the first place. The kind of,
Mm-hmm.
one described it as like this kind of endless cycle of revolving people, because
Yeah.
they kind of got to know people in this small group, and then the next semester they'd be in a different group, and maybe if the connections that they'd made in the classroom hadn't gone beyond the four walls of the classroom effectively, then they just kind of lost those people and they were just with a whole bunch of new people. And that again, it's like, well, how do we help them to we can't force them to be friends, go and see each other outside of class because it's both patronizing and also kind of you can't force or fake community. You just can't do that. And that comes time and time again in community well-being work. But yeah, we don't know how and how they want to make friends and how they do and what's effective. And I think You Belong is looking at that as part of this kind of wider understanding of belonging, but it's a very important one because students do need tools sometimes to even with things that we think they should just be doing quite naturally because they're emerging adults and we kind of think of them as adults sometimes and get quite frustrated with when they're grown-ups they should know what to do, but actually there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
And sometimes they don't, and we need to understand that.
Absolutely. And this generation have also been through a lot. They've come through schooling in a pandemic, and that's disrupted all of their own socialization as well.
Definitely.
So if we come on and talk a little bit more then about, we've talked a bit about what's happening within universities and things that universities are or aren't doing around all of this. One of the things that really struck me from the analysis we did of the Charter Award reports, and I'm going to have another word now that doesn't really have fixed meaning, but the role of culture came out as being incredibly important to overall well-being and how much staff and students both felt a sense of belonging, a sense of safety, a sense that being in the university was good for their well-being. And it was clear that some universities actually had placed a priority on trying to develop a healthy culture, and it was different in different institutions. And it was, it wasn't perfect anywhere, but there was very clearly, you could see in those universities where things were better, staff and students, without prompting, spoke about culture. They talked about the importance of the culture of the university, whilst that wasn't the case in some other universities. And in terms of what universities actually focus on and do, there is something about the fact that there's a bigger piece that sits behind this belonging about what is the culture of this institution, what's allowable, what isn't, what's acceptable, what isn't, how safe does it feel, how much does it feel like we look after each other and care about each other. That actually just creates the ground for community and belonging.
Yeah, definitely. You don't have communities without shared values. And if there's a mismatch there between the university culture and what that's prioritizing and what staff and students prioritize, then that makes it very difficult to form a community. So it's one of those things where you almost have to start with culture, but it's the hardest thing because, like you say, it's a very nebulous term. It means different things to different people. And people talk about a positive culture, a supportive culture, an inclusive culture, but we don't really understand fully what that means, but more importantly, how it can actually be applied in the real world. Because it's kind of easy to talk about what you want with a culture, like a culture that is compassionate and caring and supportive and all of these lovely words. But what does that actually look like? I don't know. And I think that we need to probably do some work on that, and it's kind of like taking a step back rather than trying to take something that exists and tweak around the edges and kind of put initiatives in to try and change culture. I think that sometimes there's like a bigger step back is needed, but that's scary, very hard work, and probably a lot of people wouldn't know where to start with that. But for any kind of the whole university approach, anything that's trying to shore up well-being across a whole community does need to start there. And yeah, at the moment, I feel like we don't even know how to effectively communicate with our students and how to get information to them as a very basic cultural issue. So yeah, vital but incredibly hard.
Yeah,
Certainly don't have the answers there.
Let's pick up from that then, because I think as we're coming towards the end, I think it'd be useful to think about for colleagues listening to this who are maybe working on their whole university approach, about thinking about, well, what actually are the things that are going to help here? What are things that are going to make a difference? I think, as you say, taking that step back and as a whole university community, as thinking about culture, I think obviously is a really important part of this, and about how can you create that healthy culture across the institution as much as you possibly can. Another thing that strikes me, again from the analysis that we've done, is that this is one of the areas where there's been less strategic thinking from a university perspective because we have a set of assumptions about how this all happens, and because I guess some of it we think about student union doing this, we're not thinking about the classroom doing it. That actually there's probably a need now for us to rethink what the role of the university is in creating community and belonging, and to think about it obviously in partnership with student union association or guild, but to actually think about actually what's our overall strategy is towards this. Well, there needs to be a strategic approach towards the creation of community and towards the increasing the possibility that more students are going to feel that sense of belonging, and that thinking about culture and that developing a strategy feels like the place we actually need to start rather than with lots of more ad hoc interventions. I wonder what you think of that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the kind of the ad hoc, the add-ins that like this might work, let's do that. This might work, let's do that. And firstly, they often don't get evaluated in any
Yeah.
kind of way that they'll be put in place. And then so just as one example from my own institution, we've now got personal tutors teach workshops, small group workshops to their first years in semester one. So they see them every fortnight. It's attached to a core module, so they feel like they have to be there. And this is the one consistent member of staff they have in their university life, and the one consistent group of students that they have, their tutor group going through. And we made that decision to build community more than anything else. It actually saves the university resource because those classes would traditionally have been taught by demonstrators, by teaching assistants. So that's in place, but the evaluation of it hasn't been done, and I think that that's really important. Is it actually working?
Mm,
And that's just one example out of many across the sector, I'm sure, where community building initiatives have been put in place, and nobody's then actually thought to speak to people about, do you think this is working? Is it helping you? Do you feel more connected because of this
mm,
particular thing? So I do think that kind of step back again and speaking to students and staff more and kind of genuine and meaningful involvement rather than just this might work and this might work and drawing on the evidence base. But I do
mm,
think a lot of the research, including my own, is more focused on what does this mean to you? What would good community well-being look like rather than what actually needs to happen. That's probably like the next step. You kind of need to understand what's important before you can design anything to help that. But um it's big.
it is
It's
big,
a very
absolutely.
big thing. Yeah, and I think that it needs to be strategic but also genuine. I think
Yeah.
is a really important thing. Because we can write a strategy, but it needs to actually capture things that are important to people and things that can genuinely happen and things that will help that community to thrive in reality.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And you just because you touch on a number of things that obviously if you're going to produce a strategy that is genuine, those things you just talked about, the fact that it is evidence based, it is genuinely co-created, and that it is properly evaluated are all really important to seeing one to make it more likely that it's going to work, but also to ensure that it actually works.
Yeah.
And I guess within that, if you're co-creating, to want to include as many different voices as possible in that co-creation, but also that your strategy is aiming to include as many people as possible and to identify who's normally lost, who's normally forgotten about, and to try to include as many people as possible.
Yeah.
And I'm struck as well by our earlier conversation about within that strategic approach, thinking about things like the physical environment, as you just pointed out, that's really important. And the role of curriculum as the social space, and also that need to think about the community of staff in that approach overall is also really important.
Yeah.
And actually, but if we were working on that bigger strategic level, maybe we would be able to create better communities, a better sense of belonging, and we could then evaluate that and work all of that out.
Yeah.
I'm also mindful as well, though, that I think those are probably things for colleagues to take away and think about. But there are also bigger questions out there that obviously we need to all be aware of and still have national conversations on. And I'm struck by the fact that some of the things we're seeing universities genuinely trying to do, which is to alter things because they're recognizing the impact of cost of living on students. They're trying to reduce the need to come onto campus. They're altering timetables in order to do that. Actually, that's mediating a bigger problem, which is students should be able to afford to come onto campus.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, it's a kind of it's a short-sighted and reactive approach to a very difficult set of circumstances facing the nation at the moment. Um, but then once those changes get made, it's difficult to roll back from them. Which is something I said before. If you remove spaces, they don't get rebuilt or they don't get repurposed into what they were initially intended to be. after they've been changed into something else. And I think you're right. It is kind of, it's important to support the fact that students are facing a cost of living crisis, but not to the detriment of their sense of community. And people probably aren't thinking enough about that. And obviously, there's the Student Minds Manifesto, which is very much calling on government to address exactly these types of issues, which I think is really important. Um, and I think that a lot of, when it comes to community wellbeing, a lot of initiatives that can be in place, they could be very cost effective and just use existing resource and existing space. It's more about culture, like you say, that kind of encourages people to use the spaces, to be in them, and to build those connections. And, you know, I think that those things need to happen and can happen without a huge investment. The investment needs to be in energy and communication, and, you know, from leadership really genuinely saying this is important and we want this to happen. It's not so much investment of money, I think, which obviously every university is strapped for cash at the moment, as are individuals and households. So there are those barriers, but I think that we can kind of look beyond those. And more long term as well. I think short term thinking is never good for culture. And it's not going to actually drive any kind of cultural change that is, like I say, meaningful and useful. You need to be, looking to the future, and that's something that's missing from a lot of community wellbeing research, is the idea of the sustainability of communities. And communities are sustainable when connections happen, and then, you know, new people join in, and then they see those connections, and if that's not happening, then they break down. And they're not sustainable. So I don't mean sustainability in a kind of environmental sense. I mean in sustainability as in the kind of longevity of community, which is very difficult in universities, where you have groups of students who come in and go away and come in and go away. Less so with staff. But we need to, that should be part of the culture, I think, is to, what does a good community look like? How can we shore that up and keep it going for generations to come within the confines of what we have now, but not too focused on now, because now is not going to be how things are forever. Well, we hope.
Well, absolutely. Yeah, we don't want now to steal from the future. Absolutely. So I suppose that we come to a close then, really, with calls for a number of things. One is things that colleagues can do within their own university, and as you say, that doesn't necessarily need to take a lot of resource, but it does need to focus on the importance of community and the importance of prioritizing it. A call for more research into those areas where we don't know things, and we still need to understand more, and a call for more national action to ensure that students are actually just able to engage in community and have the space to do that, that universities have the resources they need, and that we understand that communities of learning are what universities are and have always been, and vitally needs to be protected.
Yeah, absolutely.
Alyson, thank you very much. This has been a joy and really interesting, and thank you very much for being part of this and for all the other work that you do in this space. Thank you all, and do look out for our next episode of In Conversation, which will hopefully be coming soon on our Library of Learning. Thank you all very much.